since Washington has aligned itself so closely with Moscow in this attempt to bring about a deal, any deal, as quickly as possible, that has really amounted to President Trump shooting himself in both feet and giving Russia everything it wants while looking desperate to get this deal. We heard him saying yesterday he wants to announce something on Tuesday. That's tomorrow.
Drone attacks have hit across Ukraine this morning, and Ukrainian troops have been retreating from Russia's Kursk region. It strengthens Vladimir Putin's hand. Kyiv was hoping to use Kursk as a bargaining chip in ceasefire talks. Putin ally and Russian MP Evgeny Popov told Times Radio this morning that Russia is ready for a ceasefire.
We are ready to stop the war, but we've told it with you before. We need the security guarantees. And Putin have asked few important questions. Who is going to control ceasefire? Who is going to give an order to stop fire? And is Ukraine is going to continue force mobilization? Is the West is going to continue to deliver military equipment?
Tomorrow, Presidents Trump and Putin will speak. Let's look at what concessions Russia will be demanding and what leverage the US can exert. Leigh Turner is the former British ambassador to Ukraine and author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Leigh, thanks very much for joining us.
Afternoon.
Hi. Last summer, Ukrainian troops took 500 miles of Russian territory. They seem to have lost an awful lot of it in the last couple of days. How significant is that loss?
It is significant, Manveen, because Ukraine launched this attack partly to build up morale inside Ukraine, to show that they could still win, they could still inflict pain on Russia. Partly, it is said, in order to hold on to that land as a negotiating capital in any future negotiations with the Russians, and partly to relieve pressure elsewhere on the front. So the fact that Russia has now been able to occupy back most of that territory and looks likely to capture all of it, we don't quite know that yet, is definitely good news for Vladimir Putin, along with all the other good news he's been getting out of Washington, D.C., and bad news for Ukraine.
And to add to Russian morale, there are reports that the Russians have been showing off Ukrainian weaponry in Kursk. How much of a win is this? How will this be going down amongst the public in Moscow?
I think since we had the extraordinary news in February that Vladimir Putin had spoken on the phone to President Trump, and that the American Defense Secretary said that Ukraine could forget about NATO membership and could forget about getting its land back that had been illegally occupied by Russia. There have been a series of great news stories for the Russian people. We've seen this land being reoccupied that inside Russia that Ukraine has occupied since August 2024. So really quite a long time. And really, President Putin likes to present Russia as being strong. And we know that Russia isn't strong. It's got terrible economic problems. It's got terrible manpower problems. When Ukraine gets the weapons it needs to defend itself, the Russians have terrible trouble making any kind of advances. But since Washington has aligned itself so closely with Moscow in this attempt to bring about a deal, any deal, as quickly as possible, that has really amounted to President Trump shooting himself in both feet and giving Russia everything it wants while looking desperate to get this deal. We heard him saying yesterday he wants to announce something on Tuesday. That's tomorrow. So, of course, that strengthens Russia's hand, and they're playing it as slow as possible, negotiating to maximize their advantage. You'll see they've made no concessions. They're very active on the battlefield. So Trump is really playing into Putin's hands.
And as you say, all of this came at a time where we thought the Russian economy was really suffering. We thought the Russians were quite keen on having a pause in the war, even if it was for 30 days, actually, so that they could rebuild on their side. Why are they not welcoming the idea of a ceasefire at the moment? What do you think President Trump is likely to have to promise them tomorrow in order to get it over the line?
It's quite scary, isn't it, to imagine what further concessions Trump might make to President Putin in order to get a quick deal, which seems to be Trump's obsession to show that he's a deal maker. Of course, his record on international negotiations in the past as a deal maker is pretty terrible. If you look at the deals he made with the North Koreans and with the Taliban, none of which achieved anything. But Trump is desperate to get this deal. And so the Russians, they have always been quite keen on having a ceasefire because they hold roughly 20 to 22% of Ukrainian territory. And if there is a ceasefire and that ceasefire line becomes solidified, again, I was talking about North Korea, and of course the ceasefire line there has been there for 80 years. If the line of contact in Ukraine becomes a permanent ceasefire line, then Russia will have won this war. So Russia has always wanted to have a ceasefire, but right now, where Trump is in a blinding rush to get a ceasefire, Russia sees an opportunity to slow things down and to try and get more concessions from the Americans.
You mentioned the Taliban. They always used to say around negotiations like this, you have all the clocks and we have all the time. The idea that America set a deadline on this actually gives them a much weaker hand.
Absolutely.
We understand that the discussions between President Trump and Putin will talk about not only land, but also power plants. Give us a sense, with your understanding, with your knowledge of Ukraine, which power plants might be in play and why Russia is so keen to have them.
It's a weird little corner of the negotiations that President Trump has suddenly started talking about power plants. We've not heard this before. A number of experts have been trying to figure out what he might be talking about. There seem to be two broad schools of thought here. The first is that it's about a temporary ceasefire line and just sorting out exactly where that line will run in order to not have a ceasefire line going right through the middle of important towns or areas which are very hard to demarcate. That's one argument. And the other argument is that Russia is looking at the long term and trying to grab and hold as much land as it possibly can. When it comes to this talk of power plants, one theory that I've seen discussed is that they're talking about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is in southern Ukraine. And that power plant has been under control of Russia for quite a while. And there is a theory that perhaps Ukraine would like to have it back so that it has a reliable long-term supply of electricity. But to be honest, Manveen, we're not quite sure what President Trump on this occasion, as on so many previous occasions, means exactly.
I'm sure we'll hear more tomorrow and we'll be talking about this for a very long time yet. Leigh Turner, former ambassador to Ukraine, thanks so much for joining us.